I'm Leon Barnard. I lead the design education team at Balsamiq. We make a wireframing tool called Balsamiq Wireframes. Today I'm going to try to give you a fresh look at wireframes through some tips and tricks we use and show you how they can be used by everyone involved in making software. I'll start by briefly explaining why I think that wireframes still matter, then I'll describe a framework our team developed for helping teams use wireframes together. And then I'll get into effective wireframing tips for the getting started, ideation and communication, and iteration and handoff design phases. So here's some of the themes you'll hear in this talk. They all make up what I call the wireframing mindset. Remember that the goal is to deliver software. And to do that, everyone needs to work together around a shared goal and understanding of the solution. This is a way of thinking that allows everyone on a team to work together in a similar fashion. The first two themes are don't design for your portfolio and forget about done. When I mentor students looking to get into UX design, I always tell them that getting hired in UX looks very different from doing UX. Unfortunately, to get hired, you need polish and finished work, but those can sometimes work against you in the real world of UX. The next two themes are the goal is shared understanding, and the right tool for the job is better than one tool to rule them all. In the real world of UX, communication and flexibility are critical, even more important than what you design. The next themes are people not pixels, make successful products, and focus on what you don't know. Soft skills are the keys to success as a UX designer, just like they are in so many fields. Lastly, be scrappy. To be scrappy means to make the most of what you have. It's the ability to improvise and adapt in a world full of limitations. So do wireframes still matter? With all the amazing UX tools out there, do designers even make them anymore? Haven't we evolved past a digital version of a napkin sketch? Well, let's see. Today's idea of a designer is more like that of a craftsperson, especially with all the powerful tools out there. It can feel like the way to succeed in UX is to become a tool expert. And why not? Isn't an all-in-one tool the holy grail? But making software is a team sport. Communication and collaboration are essential. UX is really two things: designing the thing and getting it built. Complex design tools have us spending more time on the first thing, but the second thing, getting it built, is usually the harder part. The problem with living in design tools is that it preserves silos. It allows you to stay at your desk all day. You have to get out there and talk to people. And I don't just mean users, I mean other people on the team. It's the designer, the person, not the design, the thing that makes the product. Good design requires storytelling, collaboration, and negotiation, among other things. Don't forget the human element of all of those pieces. Tools can support them, but they don't do them on their own. Wireframes are special because they can be both design and communication artifacts. That's what makes them so powerful. Let me explain what I mean. A good design artifact should be just enough to communicate your idea. Anything else is wasted effort. I love this image on the left, for example. It's got this great balance of visuals and text. It uses pictures where they convey the most information and text where it works better. I think design artifacts are in a sweet spot when they balance the level of detail and the way that detail is presented, using text, images, or both. In the picture on the right, the concentric circles represent the amount of effort needed to create each kind of artifact. Too much detail and complexity offer diminishing returns. The closer you are to the center, the sweet spot, the more return on investment you get out of your efforts. And I think wireframes come the closest. Also, wireframes support divergent, creative, and convergent refining processes. This isn't true for high-fidelity tools, where the effort required to create something prevents you from exploring lots of different ideas. And making changes in them is hard, so you don't spend as much time iterating during the convergent phase. Let's talk about wireframes as not just a quick way to design user interfaces created by UX designers, but as a communication, ideation, and validation tool all in one. What's great about wireframes is that they can be made and used by everyone on the team. So we wanted to create a system for teams to participate in creating effective wireframes together. This is what we call the 10 principles of effective user interface wireframes. These principles will encourage the wireframing mindset I mentioned earlier. And all the tips I'll describe later align with these principles. I'll go through them one by one. Number one is demonstrate an understanding of the problem. This means articulating or clarifying the exact problem you're trying to solve and who it impacts before you start designing. It helps designers set the context for their solution and helps teams see how the current system is not working. Number 2 is focus on user needs. This helps to ensure that what you're designing addresses a real problem that users care about. And it helps designers make sure that they're solving that real problem. And it helps teams empathize with users. Next is thoroughly explore solutions. It helps encourage you to push beyond the first few obvious ideas and get creative. It helps designers discover novel solutions and helps teams see the value in design. Number 4 is don't show more detail than necessary. What this does is it forces you not to get hung up on things that can be decided later. And it helps designers stay focused on only what they need to be designing or fixing. And it invites teams to give feedback throughout the process. Next is functional, not fanciful. This means designing for usefulness, consistency, and implementability. It helps designers focus on structure, user flow, and possible solutions, things that are more important during this phase. It helps teams remember that the problem is the focus, not the user interface. Next is follow UI design patterns. This is useful because it helps you learn when and how to use standard user interface controls and elements. It helps designers create feasible and familiar solutions, and helps teams understand why these patterns exist and how users benefit from them. Number 7, invite discussion. It's okay to keep your designs unfinished, especially when there's areas about them that you don't know the answer to. It helps designers get feedback and buy-in, and it helps everyone on the team make sure that their voice is heard. Number 8, incorporate ideas from others. So when you get feedback, make sure you incorporate it into the design. It helps designers generate better concepts and solutions, and helps teams feel included in the design process. Number 9 is making sure that your wireframes are easy to understand. Once they're finished, take the extra step to make them readable by others. It helps designers make their designs comprehensible, and it inspires teams to communicate clearly outside of their silos by considering who they're presenting their artifacts to. Number 10, validate the solution with users and team members. After all, it's better to catch a mistake here during the design phase than once coding starts. This helps give designers confidence that their design addresses the problem. It encourages teams to involve real users before taking the next step. After all, what's the biggest roadblock to better user experience? It's not design tools or design skills. It's design culture and process. That's what these principles are meant to address. So this can be used as a checklist for the entire team, not just the designer. It serves to remind the designer that wireframes aren't complete unless they get input and feedback from others. And it sets up a process or culture where the entire team is expected to participate in the design of the product. So now let's look at some examples of these principles. Let's start with 2 tips for using wireframes at the very beginning of the design process, before you even start doing user interface design work. Tip number 1 is set the stage. Setting the stage means defining the context before you begin designing. Define before you design. If you dive right in, you might end up solving the wrong problem, which is a very hard thing to fix later. So at Balsamiq, we do something called live wireframing sessions, where we partner with nonprofits who usually don't have a designer of their own, looking to design or redesign their apps or sites. We spend an hour with them wireframing their ideas to come up with a good user experience that they can then discuss with their development team. This is a trick that I first learned from our CEO and founder. Here's a video of him using it with a nonprofit called Food for Change.
How about we start with the actors,
Sure.
Which are, you said the donation rep,
Yeah.
donation
So this one is
manager, right? Well, I think we're gonna have to focus on the most important ones to start, but we can list them all, right? Hub manager, charity manager, charity rep. Did I get them all?
Yeah. So to prioritize that, the managers are probably the less important ones.
Yeah.
They're kind of more the admin level. Whereas
Yeah,
really the
I agree.
usability, part of the usability is to make sure it's easy for the individuals to just get the main transactions.
Right. So, so why don't we try to workflows? why don't we try to model a donation from start to finish?
That sounds good.
Right. So what we're going to have to do is donation manager. We'll call it PM. Starts a donation. PM brings it to the hub. Charity manager, and CM. Charity manager is notified, right, of new donation. Is that right? After that is
We'll skip
DM
ahead a little bit here.
marks the donation as delivered, right?
So as you can see, he takes the first wireframe in his project and uses it to write down the actors or personas and then the workflows. This sets the stage for the wireframing process. So why do this in a wireframe? Why not in the journey map or other supporting documentation? Well, you can, and you should also have it there, but putting it in the wireframe connects the goal and problem to the design, so you can refer to it. It's like a compact version of the research. Wireframes aren't just for UI design, they can also be a design notebook. And here's an image from a live wireframing session that I did. Just taking some time to go through the process of writing down the users and goals will help keep you focused on solving the right problem when you're designing. The next tip is visualize connections. This one follows closely after the previous step. Let's pick up where the other one left off. This is another video where my colleague Mike is helping someone create a sitemap for their running site.
Now, the runner's view, we talked about just changing this a little bit, but the first thing that we mentioned was there's a data entry portion, which is logging your runs, right?
Yes.
What do you want to label that? So,
Log distance.
log distance. And is that a form in the page, or is it what form does that take?
Right now, it's a separate. There's a button, and that's a separate page with just the form on it.
Okay, so that's a separate page. And then, so runner's view is we can kind of think about that as having different components, I guess. It's not really part of this site map, but just think about this as like a mind map, not a separate pages. But this is your view. Oh, then let me just put the leaderboard here as a separate node or something, the page, the sibling. Okay, so your runner's view has your, what did we say? Your sum of your miles, achievements. These are your badges, right? Your achievements.
Yep.
That we'll use to start wireframing.
Skip ahead a little bit here.
Maybe we could focus just on this view then, this runner's view. You want to wireframe that out?
Sounds good.
All right.
So I chose this video because I wanted to show the real process. It's messy, it's not linear. There are a lot of hard clarifying questions. It's not easy, but you'll need to address these eventually, so it's better to do it before design starts. The key is to visualize. Turn the context into something visual that you can refer to while you're designing. It's easy to see how this can make the UI design phase much faster. And there are lots of ways to do it. It doesn't have to be a sitemap. What matters is that you have something to guide you and something to refer back to when you're designing. You want to create a picture of the connections to keep in your brain when you're working on the UI. So now let's talk about the core of what people think of when they talk about what UX designers do, the most designy design phase. So now we're getting into the creative part of the process. So tip number 3 is called go down dark paths. What I mean by this is that you can't see where they lead or end up. There's an element of unknown. Here's a video of me creating some ideas for a to-do app while thinking out loud. I'll start in the middle for the sake of time. Notice I've created another duplicate of the previous one, and I'll create another one to kind of keep branching my ideas as I go. So it doesn't look too bad. Let's go ahead and try to design, kind of redesign or design the categories configuration screen. So again, I'm going to use this iPhone menu, kind of leverage some of the styles that are in there. I'm looking for the one that allows me to reorder things, that little equal sign, and then delete. So it doesn't look too bad for an edit categories menu screen. And then, oh yeah, we need a way to add a new category. Let's add a little text input field here, show a keyboard to show that, you know, that's where you can add new categories. Kind of like that idea with the text input on the top. Let's see if we can do that here. Instead of just having the plus button, just have a little default placeholder line here. So that's an alternative to that plus button design above it. Doesn't look too bad. Let's kind of separate it a little bit so that you don't need to do it per category. You just do it once. And then we need to figure out what happens, how you assign it to a category. So let's explore a few more different ideas here. So what if we have some uncategorized items? See how that feels. Feels like maybe it'd be kind of a lot of work to then have to move them into categories. Maybe just going to give up on that idea. So let's think about some ways that we can check off these items after we're done with them. Well, here's an idea for adding new to-do items and then assigning them to a different category. Let's use a little drop-down list button so you can add one and then immediately assign it to a category, including unassigned. Let's see how that feels. So maybe you noticed that there was an idea in there that I discarded, but then I kind of picked up steam when I got back to the earlier design thread. You don't know where you'll end up when you start. So what's happening here is that in this video is that I'm switching back and forth between doing and thinking. Each thing I create leads me to new questions. And there are some phrases that I found myself using that I wanted to highlight from the video. Let's see what happens. Then we need to figure out. Let's explore. Here's an idea. Let's see how that feels. So this is the essence of the open mode. It's the creative process at work. You can't go in with a set idea of the end result when you start. Like I said, wireframes are a great tool for divergent processes. This slide illustrates what I mean. In this image, the left side shows a scenario where you already know where you're going. You may do some iteration, but you're not going broad enough to see the best options. There's no dark paths there. Real creative exploration looks like the illustration on the right. It requires some leaps and ventures into the unknown. So I encourage you to do something that's a bit out there every time, just to give you some ideas that you might incorporate. Even if you know it won't work, it doesn't mean it's all bad. The best designs come from combining ideas from a bunch of different design branches, like the image on the right. If you can see where you're headed when you start, you're being too conservative. The next tip is share unfinished work. High-fidelity artifacts don't work well for this. There are just too many dependencies and parts to update. But wireframes thrive in in-between, incomplete states. Their most comfortable state, I would argue, is in process. They don't force you toward completion. Here's a wireframe I created with a very open-ended space on the right-hand side. If I had guessed and put something specific there, I would have gotten feedback on that, rather than starting a conversation about what could go there. You can't read it, but there's a bunch of ideas in that little sticky note. Your uncertainty creates a gap for others to fill, and that's a good thing. And don't be afraid to let your wireframes be conversational. Showing where you're uncertain will invite others to contribute. Here's another example of an early wireframe I made that was intended to provoke discussion. It's still in the open creative mode, but I'm involving others. I'm just throwing things out there and asking for input. It's not complete by any means. Show what you don't know so that you can find someone who does. This will also help get buy-in from people who don't normally participate in the design process. They may even become design advocates. Next is leverage design systems. Design systems are all the rage these days, and for good reason in my opinion. One of my favorite things about them is that they take the visual design and interactive behavior out of the UI design, so you don't need to specify these when designing. This makes them a perfect companion to wireframes. So now you can design in low fidelity, but with your framework components in mind. You don't need to specify much more because the design system has it built in. One thing you can do to facilitate this is create a quick mapping document of wireframe components to their design system counterparts, so that developers know what you mean when you use them. They don't even have to look the same. Close enough is good enough, just as long as everyone understands. Remember, the goal is shared understanding, not pixel-perfect mockups. You can now design in low fidelity and go straight to code from there. No need for interactive prototypes. Next is be deliberate about details. It's easy to get hung up on details. It's natural. And I'm not saying not to include detail in your design. It's all about including the right details. Good design artifacts are rough enough that you can iterate easily, but detailed enough that you can get your ideas across. Think about why you're putting details in and where you are in the process. Are you focusing on layout, content, interactivity? The more detail you put in, the more work it takes to change, and the harder it is for viewers to digest and review. So don't over-design early in the process. Here's an example of using detail deliberately. Often you'll have one component repeated many times on a page. There's no need to create a high detail version of it throughout. What I like to do is show a zoomed in view so that the details are there, but you can see the high level view for the main screen. It helps direct the focus. Zoom in on one area so that you can stay zoomed out elsewhere. Here's what I mean. In this wireframe, I left out most of the design for the left-hand side. I deliberately used low detail there and high detail on the right, because I wanted to focus on the part in green. Low detail says, don't pay much attention to this part, and sometimes that's the message you want to convey. What you don't put in your wireframe can be as important as what you do put in. So now we're moving on to the getting it built phase, which is as important, if not more important, than the design phase. Tip number 7 is design for the feedback you want. You should always consider your audience when designing. At some point, you'll be ready to present or hand off, and you want to keep them in mind. You want to keep in mind who will be reviewing it and what you want from them. If you're not careful, you'll get a bunch of feedback that's focused in the wrong place. It's your job to direct it to the right place. Or you'll get no feedback at all, which is even worse. Design artifacts don't have to have all the answers. Wireframes don't, and that's the point. They're a tool to get the answers. Going back to detail, the more detail you put in, the more feedback you'll get. So if you present a detailed design, make sure that you're prepared for feedback on all of it. The image on the left is clearly more focused on the general layout and responsive behavior, while the one on the right has very specific alignment guides and text formatting details. These two designs will elicit very different feedback. And here are two versions of the same page for two different feedback cases, again, depending on the level and type of feedback you want. There are actually several ways you can direct feedback, not just by varying the amount of detail. You can also use callouts or annotations to direct feedback to specific areas. Contrast and novelty also attract attention and feedback, so anything that stands out will attract more feedback. Adding screenshots into your design is a good way to take attention away from those parts of the design, as people will already be familiar with them. They'll pay more attention to the wireframe part, the part that's different. Or you can crop out the rest of the design, like the image on the lower right, and just show a small portion to focus feedback on it specifically. Next is use the least effort method. This is kind of a general tip that encompasses many of the previous tips. This one is all about prioritizing results, the outputs, over inputs. Going too deep into designing can often offer diminishing returns. It's important to think about the incremental value of adding more to your wireframes. Time is always limited in a software project, so don't spend time designing things that don't matter. For example, this design uses screenshots for half of the design rather than recreating them as wireframes. I call these hybrid designs, and I use them a lot. Here are some other examples. Remember, you're not designing for your portfolio. Design for shared understanding. When someone sees a screenshot, they'll know that's not the thing you're designing. It's simply there for context. Also, instead of adding details in the design, you can keep it low fidelity and add words to describe what the design doesn't explain. Sometimes it's easier to describe the behavior of a control than to show it. So just do that. Learn when to show and when to tell. I used to do this a lot in Agile user stories. Last but not least, make sure you ship the damn thing. I think that designers should take responsibility for getting their designs implemented. It's too easy to put that on PMs or developers. You have to be accountable for creating something that can be built and help push it across the finish line. Dribbble is full of great designs that will never make their way into an actual product. This is one of my first experiences doing just that, not thinking about implementation, but rather what I thought would be really cool. It was a high-fidelity drag-and-drop editor for a very technical product that went way beyond what was technically feasible and would have been approved in the design culture where I worked. But I spent a ton of time designing it because I got attached to it, and I got confused into thinking that what looks real is real, but it's not. That's what high fidelity design can do to you. This is pie in the sky design. Don't do it. It only counts if it ships. The impulse when diving into the wireframing process is to create your ultimate vision for the product. Your first wireframes are often closer to version 3 of the product than its MVP. Adding features and other really cool stuff is basically free at this point, since you don't actually have to build it here. But it's a tricky situation. If you only wireframe the bare minimum, on the other hand, you risk losing your great ideas and vision. A solution is to design your ideal version of the product and then progressively descope it by creating a series of less fully featured versions until you reach an MVP level wireframe. In this scenario, you can end up with several in-between concepts between the ideal version and the MVP. This turns out to be a really useful thing to have. It can be used as a roadmap for your next releases working from MVP on up. I would often create designs and separate out the more complex parts into separate user stories so that we could build them over multiple iterations, starting with the basics like a simple data table, and then adding things like search and filtering. An even simpler alternative is to include your idea for how it should look or work, but also show an acceptable substitute that you know is easier to build. It's better to be involved in shipping something that's just okay than to be left out completely. This is how real work gets done, by finding a way to deliver in compromised situations. So let's review. Here are 9 tips for more effective wireframing. They span all phases of the process, from the initial requirements gathering to getting the product out the door. They go beyond what most people think of as the wireframing phase. And here's the checklist for team wireframing based on 10 principles of effective wireframes. And lastly, let's return to those themes I started with. But this time, let's talk about them outside of just wireframing. In most cases, they're not specific to wireframing or any particular tool or artifact. They're a way of thinking. I don't want to only tell you how to make better wireframes. I'd love to help you become a better designer with these themes. Wireframes are a simple design artifact, but they also embody a certain philosophy. The reason that wireframes work so well is that they're flexible, built for communication, and results-oriented. These tenets can be a mindset for all parts of the UX role. It's one that I've embraced successfully in my career as a designer. And lastly, a few credits and a plug for our free site called Balsamic Wireframing Academy, where a lot of this content comes from. Thank you for your time and attention, and happy wireframing.